Nicholas Eftimiades, thank you so much for joining us today. And should I call you professor? Is
Uh,
that
you can.
China expert, Homeland Security expert, and also I think one of the key voices on counterintelligence and espionage from the CCP. So thank you very much for coming on today. I kind of, we want to go deep, but I think as a generalizing question, how would you evaluate the state of Communist Party espionage today compared to maybe 5 to 10 years ago? Is it worse? Is it evolving? What's your take on the current situation?
I will tell you it's worse,
Mhm.
particularly in the area of transnational repression. If we want to include that category in, then it's definitely worse. But much of this is also, how much is actually detected.
Mm.
Are they doing more over the last 5 years, or have we just been detecting more over the last 5 years? I'd say as a long-term trend over the last since the Xi Jinping era, there's no question there's been an escalation, particularly in economic espionage, and that's largely because China has moved so quickly to catch up, if you will, in technology and in market share placement, things like that. That economic espionage now becomes more attractive to them as a way of supporting their research industrial base.
Do you when you're talking to the government, people in the government, what's the biggest concern to them right now? Because we understand the age of technology has evolved, right? AI wasn't really a conversation maybe a few years back. Now it's one of the top ones. I think even a lot of the technologies in the newer space. I think with in this like actual space in I think even the fact that we're now talking about some of the things that continue to happen, but weren't some issues back then. I think I would say uh, perhaps even the possibility of robotics, the possibility of next generation weaponry. Are those some of the things that's in the minds of lawmakers today?
Well, here's the problem. Um, and it depends if you're talking to lawmakers or government
Mm,
people. But it fundamentally strikes at a problem. Everyone has their own particular concerns.
mm,
You talk to the Department of Commerce and its dual use technologies. You talk to DHS and its arms trafficking regulations, military related technologies, and the FBI has its own focus. So we're kind of disjointed in our concerns and our responses, right? Very few people sit atop and get an entire picture of what's happening and how to understand it and are able to form a government response. And probably our biggest lacking is lack of a government response. So the concern lately is AI. And
mm.
that's because we've seen China hacking to try and steal AI. Prior to that, it was vaccines. It was COVID related, as China aggressively was using cyber and as well as insider threats to steal U.S. Research in vaccines. Prior to that, and still continuing, it was semiconductors. As of 2015, when the US government sanctioned ZTE, China ramped up a campaign for stealing semiconductors, and actually typically really semiconductors, because there's something like a million different parts you need to build a semiconductor, to build a factory. So we've seen an escalation in that theft. So it really depends. It actually is policy reactive
Mm.
as to what they shift to start their aggressive collection efforts on.
That was what I wanted to get to eventually. Was it has but the reaction decreased and more proactive approach increased? Is that a trend, or is it hasn't been like that?
Well, no, I will say that it definitely has increased, particularly if you look at it over a time period. Because as I said, 20 years ago, China was so far back in technology that it didn't do them a lot of good to steal, cutting edge things on semiconductors, because they never had the manufacturing capability to produce them anyway. So, but as China's caught up over the past 2 decades, now it goes after the cutting edge stuff.
Mm.
Like it's stealing the cutting edge research in AI, the cutting edge research in semiconductors. And that's the problem, because that stuff is typically least protected because it's research. It's in some ways, much of it is academic. So it is tends to be very, very lightly protected. And that's where they're making their biggest gains.
If you're looking at, I guess this is more political than actually the security side. But if you're looking at the narrative right now, a lot of times when we're talking about China, it's like, oh, maybe we're doing the same thing to them. Maybe we're also I wouldn't say comparatively we're doing the same, but people are saying that we're doing the same to what China does to us, like corporate espionage, IP theft, but those kind of things. But it's actually not the same level, right?
No, not at all. In fact, China's collection activities are so vastly more expansive than any Western democracy. You know, transnational repression. You're threatening people's families and literally sometimes, physically torturing them or imprisoning them to conduct transnational repression globally. Do you know a Western democracy that does that? No. Stealing technology as solar panels are a perfect example. China
Mm.
stole and was prosecuted out of the state of Pennsylvania for this. A military unit, 61398, cyber attacks, stole technology for solar panels. China then turned around and invested in a company and invested to, using that technology that they stole, that insider information, and to develop solar panels, drop the bottom out of the market, and basically put the U.S. out of business. And that is what China does. It's like a parasite. It steals, and then it invests intelligently. It invests in government investment within that theft to develop an industry, and the costs come in so much lower because it has government backing. The costs come in lower, and they're able to put other countries out of business. So it's not a fair competition. All this rests on their collection capabilities. And it's a combination, it's what I call a whole of society approach. Combination of government, private industry, state-owned enterprises, all working in somewhat unison, all financially benefiting from it. And it's resulted in trillions of dollars worth of economic wealth going to China.
I think a lot of people will be wondering about what does the picture look like? Is there a like a organization in China that's issuing the orders to those companies to say that, or is the organization actively approaching somebody in the U.S. right now to do this? Can you paint a picture for us? Like, how does the network of this whole espionage situation going down?
Well, that's I'll tell you a story.
Mm,
Many years ago, I was working with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and I had approached them about activities that were ongoing, and specifically in the area of naval technologies. And they said, Nick, we can't do anything with this case. I said, why not? And I said, well, does the guy work for the Ministry of State Security? And I went, no. And they said, well, I mean, it has to be something that we can tag to the MSS before we do it. And here's the problem with the US mindset, right? If it's not China's civilian intelligence agency, the Ministry of State Security, now things have changed a lot over the years, but but the attitude was, no, well, we work against their government intelligence services. The problem is you have half of the economic espionage being conducted by private industry in China
mm,
with government support, with financial support, with support, being able to move the technology back. But it's half done by private industry, probably 25% by state-owned enterprises. Many of these times in coordination with the intelligence services, Ministry of State Security, but oftentimes, without just party committees, CCP committees within those organizations. So if you give credit to the CCP for one thing and one thing only, it's bureaucratic mastery.
mm.
I mean, they have party committees that go through state-owned enterprises, that go through private companies. So, I mean, everyone knows what the CCP wants. The CCP says, and announces in documents made in China 2025, for example, these technologies are critical to the growth and development of China. Everybody goes out after them. Ministry of State Security or CCP officials at provincial levels go to support that effort. So this is why, in some ways, you have very amateurish espionage activities going on, but you have them en masse. You have them
Mm.
being conducted by companies, by students, by scholars, by state-owned enterprises. And I mean, that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, which maybe 1% might actually be involved. But still, that 1% winds up to be thousands of people. And we have the best counterintelligence services in the world, and we're incapable of dealing with it.
I don't remember where I heard this story. Maybe I read it somewhere, but it was pretty recent. It was about how these democracy protesters from China living in the Bay, is it the Bay Area or somewhere in California? And essentially, they ran into these agents that the local Chinese embassy had hired. And the story essentially goes something like he was told that he can do pretty much anything, like harm those democracy protesters, and the Chinese government would they used the Chinese word, they said doja, which basically just means like they're shielded by the the embassy and the government. I just thought the audacity for those words to be said was interesting because this is on American soil, and then half of me believes that they won't shield this person because like they can just bail if things are really bad because they want to protect the government, right? But the other half, I thought it was they were serious about this, that they're willing. You mentioned the transnational repression part, right? Because if they weren't serious about dealing with the dissidents, they wouldn't go as far as to say this. I do you see the because we're talking about espionage. Usually, it doesn't involve violence, right? But is there any connection to this whole thing where you have almost physical, I wouldn't say casualties, but damage being done alongside the more financial and economic side of things?
Um, okay, so are we talking about in the economic espionage realm or in the transnational
I
repression?
it's
The
I think it
I can go both.
Yeah,
The-
if you
the-
can, because I think my point was to say that whether or not it's a because I'm trying to understand if it's a one system thing or is there separate things going on or are they all somehow connected?
Yeah, that's interesting. Uh, in the West, they have to get used to the mindset that it's not connected. I have a database and I'm just closing in on 1,000 cases in that database, which is one case might have 5 individuals. So it has thousands of people, hundreds and hundreds of companies, universities, etc. And I would tell you, I know more about the variety of espionage that's being done than the Ministry of State Security does.
Mm,
People say that's crazy. And I say, no, the MSS really knows about its slice. It doesn't know what state-owned enterprise is necessarily doing. It doesn't know what a company's doing. So it's China has created this entire ecosystem for espionage, and it's regular espionage, it's economic espionage, it's transnational repression, it's little pinks doing things like flying drones over military bases and stuff just to get in good position with the party.
hmm
Just to, it's transnational repression, just to show you're a loyal party member for your own economic benefit back in China.
Yeah.
So China's created an entire ecosystem, and it's impossible to keep your hands, a handle on who's doing what. There's a lot of redundancy, a lot of people going
Mm,
out trying to get the same things, but the end result is that they do get a lot coming in. As for the use of violence or sabotage, look, we've seen the penetration of tens of thousands of critical infrastructure companies, right?
mm,
Because 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by private companies in the US. And we've seen the, cyber penetrations of thousands upon thousands of them for years done by China. So, and that's not done, out of friendliness and openness,
yeah.
right? That's done to shut America off, should China ever desire to. Not a very friendly act. Sabotage in the exact definition of the word. We've seen violence in transnational repression. Falun Gong and Shenzhen, the dance group, documents dozens of cases of threats, terrorist, what are literally terroristic threats, destruction of property, physical threats to them all the time, every year. So, and I've been on the phone listening in when people are being threatened or hurt back in China, talking to dissidents here in the United States. So it's real. And that threat, the physical violence part exists, and the potential for physical action through sabotage also exists.
How much do you think this is ideological? That they arrived at this. You mentioned the end result is getting favor from the party, right? I understand the economic incentive is probably huge, but how much of it do you think is actually ideological in the way that they teach the people to think this way?
Good question. In those 1,000 cases I mentioned, about 600 of them, I was able to tie to motivations. And some of those motivations I listed as ethno-nationalism.
Mm,
Because it's really not necessarily political nationalism. Like, I believe in freedom and democracy, I'm doing this.
yeah,
Um, but we get a lot of people, I believe in China. I'm doing this for Mother China.
I see.
That's an often said response, particularly in the national security realm. National security cases, if it's not recruiting a Westerner, like a
Mhm,
retired intelligence officer, which is or a young person they typically go after. There's a lot of ethno-nationalism in MSS officers in particular, wanting to do that type of activity. But by and large, as I mentioned, the party sets the circumstances where you can't benefit economically, certainly not in a big way, unless you are cooperative, unless you're accepted in the party, unless you're working for the party, and even such things as a united front. In every time a person signs up for the party, one of the things that they have in the bylaws is that you have to support united front efforts. So it is enlisting an army. globally.
It's interesting now. As we do this interview, it's been a day since the new Chinese law of ethnic unity has been activated, right? So I thought of because now I personally think the law is up to interpretation for how much damage it could do. But one of the things I noticed is it considers every Chinese person, whether you wanted it or not, to be a Chinese national for the sake of this law, right? So even this, let's say you're an American citizen, but you go to China with the Chinese passport, uh, the American government has less I guess power to rescue you compared to if you went in with an American passport. I don't there's a lot of details to this, but my point to ask was is is there any even defense against, because China seems to just always be coming out with these new overreaching rules and doing the way that they want to do, but it doesn't seem like any Western country really has a way to defend against, right? Because you can't really do things the same, you can't copy what China does, and so it feels like you're always at a disadvantage that way.
Well, here, yeah, you actually hit on the core of the problem. And the problem is the way Western democracies respond to China, which is typically defensive.
Mm,
And, China is relentless in its cyber attacks. It's the number one nation in the world for cyber attacks anywhere. That's right, right? And what's the US response? The US response is, well, we'll build bigger cyber walls. We'll build bigger defenses. And that if it's government, that costs the taxpayers. If it's, commercial, that costs the consumers. There's no incentive for China to stop.
mm,
We never turn around and say to China, tell you what, we're going to kick a state-owned enterprise off the US stock exchange and starve you of capital for doing this, right? It's the same thing with their behavior against dissidents. It's the same thing with their transnational repression. Every action we take is a defensive one. And the result is that we provide no incentives for China to stop their behavior. So, yes, is it your own population? You can do with it what you like. Yeah, but if you do happen to do that to a U.S. citizen, we're gonna sail a carrier through the Straits of Taiwan.
mhm.
So you don't like it? Don't just arrest people for no particular reason other than to make a political point. They don't feel any pain for any of their actions, and that's the problem. It's like dealing with a child. If a child goes hitting you and your response is just to move out of the way, or put on pads to protect yourself, no incentive for the child to stop. If you take away the child's toys, the child stops.
Mm.
It's, in dealing with China, we don't take away China's toys. We don't give them any reason to stop. This is a fundamental. It's a shyness. There's no deterrence in our actions.
It, of the cases that you've been studying, have you noticed any pattern? I wanted to use the three examples would be for China, for Iran, and for a free world nation. So Iran, obviously, there's a religious aspect to it, right? So everything you mentioned the ethno nationalism with China, and is there any motivation from those cases where they felt like it was I don't know if the religiously would be the good word for it, but it felt like it's a pseudo religious motivation for them to, they really believe in something that's maybe ethno nationalism is one of them, but is there anything like that of what people do in Iran, like to support the Ayatollah and that type of thing?
Um, I don't think well, there's certainly a theocracy in Iran, right? So there's
Hmm.
a ideological component, you could say, within that theocracy, certainly. Um, Now the problem is for Iran is that very, very small theocracy has a stranglehold over the entire country. And I don't think the entire country you're going to find believes in stoning a woman, for what we would define as ridiculous reasons, for getting raped and then she's stoned to death, for that. So Iran's got, I mean, the belief structure you could say parallels a little.
Mm,
It's a very tight knit group of individuals at the senior leadership, and trying to push a theocracy, and in the case of the CCP, trying to push an ideological belief unto its own, people. And in recent years, they've had a lot of success. The CCP has had more success over the last 10 years than they've had, in its entire existence prior to that. And the reason is because economically they've delivered.
mm.
Now that's largely due to the West, but they couch it as, China can't exist without the CCP. And every good thing that happens for the CCP. And we see, this goes all the way back to the Zhou dynasty and the mandate of heaven, right? We are in charge, and that's why things are good. That's why you're economically benefiting. And to Xi Jinping's credit, that's why he's trying to spread that economic benefit throughout China. So it's not just an elitist class that goes to support, but it actually gets to the peasants, because that's where China's always had its internal threats from. So there's an ideological, there's a social contract that's in play. Don't challenge us and we'll make you wealthy. We'll raise your economic standard of living. So there's a lot in play in that relationship between the CCP and society, in some ways similar to the relationship between the theocracy in Iran and its society. By and large, Iran society doesn't believe it.
Mm.
And you're getting to a point where a lot of China's society doesn't believe it. So
you mentioned Xi Jinping, I thought maybe let's talk about this because he calls his time the new era, right? Like it's not necessarily the reform and opening up anymore. It's like the new era. But it feels to me like in this so-called new era, there's more stealing and more taking others' stuff than actually. Well, I mean, if you ask a Chinese, like a pro-China person, they would tell you that China has done a lot of innovation, which we know that a lot of it comes from the Western capital investment and also the Western technology. But I think my point is like, are things different now than they were during like the like Hu Jintao era, and where supposedly China and the U.S. had a sort of a better relationship? Is there any significant changes from these two
Oh
periods?
yeah, no question, no question. The Hu Jintao era, when we had an opening of China, and the West coming in and business, surfacing and business relationship surfacing, differs dramatically from now. I mean, now China has invested. China is producing more warships at a faster rate than the United States did before and during World War II.
Mm,
I mean, China is physically threatening all its neighbors, physically threatening the United States with its military power, and actually executing on threats to its economic power and what you would call subversion globally. So China has stepped up to becoming a world power, and a lot of this is a little subject to to analysis as you take a look. Like 40% of China's GDP is actually investment.
mm,
And the West leads the way on that. Cut the investment and China's GDP drops.
yeah.
They don't happen to note that publicly. So so a lot of it is smoke and mirrors, but nonetheless, China's grown as a global power, and in so doing, it's become pretty adversarial.
Mm.
Taking over the South China Sea. I mean, what the heck? The UN saying no, it's not really yours. By all the rules you signed up for, it's not yours, and they don't care. Lawfare. They're using everything to their advantage, and they're backing it with their military. We didn't have that under the Hu Jintao era. China was growing up, but more in a peaceful fashion. So this is where the separation starts and where the threat actually comes from.
So I know a year or two ago, the big thing, especially I think on the Republican side, was about the farmlands in the U.S. Right? You had
Right.
people who were buying it next to the Air Force bases in Texas. You had people who were investing in just. So you're seeing a lot of these motives for espionage operations. I wanted to know if are the examples we hear in the news the all that there is, or is there any like more cases that we're not being told because it could be a little bit more worrisome for the regular people to hear. And it seems like these cases are now I don't know if they're being done and anything done about them, but it sounds like they just kind of got washed away in the news cycle and people don't talk about it anymore.
Well, you are correct. They do get washed away in the news cycle. Um, and you have to kind of put your arms around everything that's happening
Yeah.
globally in examples for cases like this to understand the potential for it. So what have we seen with China in purchasing farmlands? Well, certainly we've seen them purchasing a lot over the United States and using
Mhm.
it for business purposes. We have seen marijuana farms,
Yeah.
legal and illegal, going into being. We've seen human trafficking going to support those farms in some cases. I mean, as ICE has raided those farms and has people locked up, and people have been locked up for working on the farms as basically slave labor. So we've seen examples of that. We have seen globally multiple examples in France and now Norway of China buying either land or houses, or I'm sorry, Chinese companies or individuals buying land and houses and then putting up satellite dishes to try and pilfer U.S. military communications, not U.S., but local military, NATO military communications. So we've seen this happen in two incidents in France and just recently in Norway, where
Mm.
The authorities stopped 22 tons of satellite receiver equipment from going out to a 36-acre farm in Norway, which was located right near one of their military and intelligence bases. So, and the company was in for selling like nutrition products, which is what flagged it for for the authorities in the first place. And they found an espionage ring trying to set this satellite dish up. 22 tons, trying to set a satellite dish up to pilfer those communications going to a Norwegian military base. So we see examples globally. We see strategic purchases. If you're purchasing next to a military base, much as we saw with the balloon flown by China,
Yeah.
it offers certain advantages, right? It offers the fact that you're within a cone, if you will, for satellite communications, right? Satellite beams down to a military base, but the cone spreads out a bit. So if you're within that, you're able to collect the satellite, transmissions. So just things like that make a person, if you're doing it for espionage purposes, make it advantageous to do so. I think these things are, I understand the spy threat, and we've certainly seen it come out. There's just no question that people have been arrested and gone to jail for doing that. So we've seen it happen globally. Is it the biggest of concerns? I think you can monitor it and watch that. But there are a lot of illegal activities that we have seen tracked to these farms, so it's understandable how there's some level of concern with them.
It's because it's very local, right? Like if you're somebody living in Oklahoma and you hear like, oh, in in the rural areas, and then you have these like illegal things. I think people are just very worried. I think another one that was in the news and also pretty shocking was the Ministry of State Security agent approaching students in Stanford and chatting them up, and that case got reported. It's because we kind of talked about this in the beginning already, but there's obviously the Ministry of State Security is one of the, not the only, but one of the biggest ones involved in the espionage chain. Are there any entities in the CCP that we don't know about? Maybe you can shed some light on this, that is also maybe to a more, I don't know, like a politically higher level, like maybe they're targeting just the Congress members, or maybe they're just targeting the government people. Like, is there like another place that they're going with this?
Yeah, there are actually several places. But just to highlight on the Stanford case, we actually don't know that was an MSS
Oh,
person,
okay.
right? So, I mean, the woman who was at Stanford who made a big deal out of espionage, and I was, well, how do you know it just wasn't a pervert trying to get you to come over to China? I mean, you really don't know. So I'm not. The media ran with that, but I didn't see any evidence that it was.
Mm,
Hey, yeah, we identified this as an MSS officer. Actually, that would be pretty difficult. But so we have the Ministry of State Security. We have the Ministry of Public Security. So things that are particularly their first bureau, which is the Political Security Bureau. And so work against dissidents overseas, what they would call counterterrorism. The collection apparatus set up under the Belt and Road Initiative all reports
mm.
back to the Ministry of Public Security. Okay, so very worldwide presence, the rendition operations, the kidnapping operations that are done for dissidents and such overseas, Ministry of Public Security. With MSS support often, but Ministry of Public Security, they're responsible for that. The United Front Work Department, with tens of thousands of people globally, and the Ministry of Public Security works with them, and the MSS 12 Bureau works with them. But the United Front Work Department has case officers, as intelligence officers, and does collection globally as well against any political party, any threat that they perceive to the party, and to try and win people over in supporting the party. The liaison department, the CCP liaison department, targets high-level officials for collection. High-level officials of foreign governments, etc., for collection. So you have multiple organizations. I mean, the state, the Science and Technology Industry for National Defense, the Science and Technology Committee for National Defense, sitting under the State Council,
Mm.
right, managing China's industrial base and universities producing technology for China. They have their own their own collection element as well that goes out with their scientists to actually target and collect technology. So it depends, where you are, but the system is multiple elements within its intelligence community. Same way the United States has an intelligence community, they do as well.
I think my last point before we end would be kind of, how do you see the if you had to, I understand it's such a wide field, but if you had to target one thing right now that's really urgent, what would you say that is? And uh, I guess the follow up would be, how concerned are we with things like basic infrastructure and critical structures being vulnerable to these attacks or espionage activities?
Well, let's go with the critical infrastructure because that really is an important issue.
Mm,
Uh, I think the Transportation and Highway Commission reported out that the signs, the street signs in the United States, the highway signs, they found backdoors in them in the software. Going back to China, the cranes on U.S. ports were reporting information to Chinese commercial ships as they were coming into port. As they got into correct distance, those cranes would report, I moved X amount of tons. This is what I moved. This was scheduled. This is what. So all that information coming out of our ports on the U.S. basic trade,
mm,
all the trade that's coming in out of ports is reported out to cranes. And what it just shows you, I mean, is the pervasiveness. Plus we've had solar panels. The solar panels at your home that were redistributed have backdoors built into the software. I've had sources reported at Zoom that tell me about how Chinese engineers are putting backdoors in the software in Zoom so that they can listen in and penetrate into conversations. And as the security staff is trying to pull them out all the time. So collectively, and I could cite you hundreds of cases, hundreds of examples, but collectively, if you look at this gives China an extraordinary ability to impact just citizens. I mean, you could argue that this is warfare that's illegal.
yeah.
It does give them that ability to have a stranglehold on the threat of the United States, in their threat to the United States, because critical infrastructure. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're talking about rare earth minerals or if you're talking about active pharmaceutical ingredients. As China has said publicly during COVID, maybe we should let the United States drown in a sea of COVID. It's a stranglehold, and it really, really is something that if we get in a tense situation with China, that they can activate and really impact lives. So that should be the biggest concern. Most people are oblivious to it.
I thought about this now that you mentioned it. Is there a secondary, how do I put it this way? Like, so, okay, so for example, TikTok is a good example of this. We for years said the TikTok was harvesting data. It was using the algorithm to brainwash people, right? Especially young people. But then look, fast forward to this year and last year, you started seeing all these trends that are making people becoming more Chinese or China maxing, these things that are becoming almost like an influence campaign. So my understanding of it would be that they collected enough data on understanding and studying Americans, for example, that they can almost formulate these campaigns tailored to the population because they know what they're struggling with, what they desire, those kind of things. So in the homeland national security and also espionage side, is there a secondary kind of front or a secondary attack that could happen based on what they gathered and what they know?
Yeah, no, and the what you say is very accurate. In fact, it's publicly come out that China uses artificial intelligence to do this,
Mm,
to identify threats, to them, and then to marshal articles and such, all done by AI to counteract that threat. So taking a step way above what is traditionally understood as propaganda efforts. I mean, and an example of this you can see in Facebook. Facebook probably takes down 60,000 websites a year. We have 60,000 Facebook sites a year that are all linked back to the CCP, trying to persuade individuals. Same thing for Twitter, or X now as it's called.
mm.
40 to 50,000 a year. So China is quickly mastering the use of AI for this and influencing populations worldwide. So herein lies the problem. We're in the West who have a strong belief in freedom of speech and such,
Mhm.
can't even consider a counter. How do you counter that?
Yeah.
I mean, you pull down websites, okay, that's a start, but how do you counter that type of coordinated attack that moves at the speed of artificial intelligence?
Mhm.
It's just it's frightening that a digital authoritarian state like China can actually implement this type of thing and bring warfare basically globally, through AI.
Very crazy. Nick, thank you very much for shedding the light on this. And I think one of the issue is obviously people are it's a tough topic, and people are going to, it's hard for people to visualize. So I appreciate you coming on and telling us this. Thank you very much.
The public education campaign here is the most important thing that we can do. I mean, just so people know, there's solar panels of a backdoor into China and things like that, so people understand this type of threat. People did in the 80s when it was the Soviet Union, but it's a whole different ballgame now, and we have new generations that are typically not used to this.
All right, Nicholas Eftimiades, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.